As the fog thickened, Carlos's sense of direction vanished completely. The road ahead, barely visible through the swirling mist, seemed endless, twisting unnaturally in ways that made no sense. He'd been driving for hours, lost in a labyrinth of eerie silence, when suddenly his headlights caught something looming in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, but as he drew closer, it materialized. A massive, decaying building, the Enchanted Valley Inn. The structure seemed out of place, like it had been abandoned by time itself. Its once grand facade now covered in creeping vines, windows broken and dark. There was no sign of life. The oppressive air felt heavier here, thick with something far more sinister than the mist surrounding him. Carlos parked his car, the engine sputtering to a stop, and stepped out into the chilling night air. The fog seemed to close in on him, as if pushing him toward the inn. His instincts screamed to leave, but an inexplicable pull urged him forward. As he approached the entrance, the ground beneath his feet felt softer, almost like he was stepping on something alive, though he couldn't see past the thick fog swirling around his ankles. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a darkened lobby, untouched by time, yet oddly preserved in decay. The stale smell of rot mixed with something metallic hung in the air, making him gag. Inside, the silence was deafening. The only sound was the soft shuffle of his footsteps across the dusty, wooden floor. The walls were lined with old, fading photographs of guests long forgotten, faces that seemed to follow him as he walked deeper into the inn. A grand chandelier, covered in cobwebs, hung precariously above, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. Carlos felt watched. Every fiber of his being screamed that he was not alone, yet there was no one in sight. The lobby, despite its dilapidated state, had an unnatural stillness, as if frozen in the exact moment the last soul had left. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind rushed past him, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed through the empty halls. He spun around, heart racing, but the door was firmly closed now, and the oppressive silence had returned. His breath quickened as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Something wasn't right. The shadows cast by his flashlight twisted and shifted in ways they shouldn't have. For a brief second, he swore he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just out of reach of the light, but when he aimed the beam directly at it, there was nothing, just darkness. His hands trembled as he continued deeper into the building, the air growing colder with each step. A faint sound began to creep into his ears, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like distant whispers carried on the wind. But as he strained to listen, the sound became more distinct, chilling him to his core. It was his name. Someone or something was whispering his name from the shadows, drawing him closer, beckoning him further into the inn's cursed depths. As Carlos ventured deeper into the inn, a sense of familiarity began to gnaw at the back of his mind. The stale air, the dimly lit hallways, even the musty scent of decay seemed to stir something buried within him. He couldn't quite place it, but the inn felt disturbingly familiar, like he had been here before. His mind raced, but the harder he tried to recall, the more elusive the memories became. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, leading him to a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Against his better judgment, he pushed it open. Inside, the room was small, dusty, and lifeless, with an old wooden bed, a dresser, and a window covered in grime. The moonlight barely pierced through the fog outside, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Something caught his eye, a small object lying on the dresser. His breath hitched in his throat as he approached. It was a stuffed bear, old and tattered, but unmistakably the same toy he had cherished as a child. The faded blue ribbon, tied around its neck, sent a chill down his spine. Carlos hadn't seen this bear in decades, not since it had mysteriously vanished during a family trip when he was 7 years old. The memories flooded back violently. He remembered that trip to the countryside, the small cabin near the woods, and the night he had gotten lost. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, but Carlos had wandered too far into the forest, following a strange melody that echoed through the trees. That night, he had been missing for hours, found only at dawn, shivering and terrified. He never spoke of what happened, and his family had long since forgotten the incident. But now here, in this cursed inn, the past was clawing its way back to him, refusing to stay buried. As Carlos picked up the bear, his hand brushed against something cold, something metallic. His heart raced as he turned the toy over, revealing a rusty old key stitched into the bear's back. The stitching was crude, as if done in a hurry, but it had held for years, concealing the key within. Why was this key hidden in his childhood toy? His mind reeled with questions, but the deeper he thought, the more the memories resurfaced. Images of dark woods, a faceless figure, and a whispering voice that had haunted his dreams for years. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his hand, and he gasped. The old scar on his palm, the one he had gotten that night in the forest, began to throb and burn, as if reacting to the key. He looked down, his hand trembling. The scar, once faded and barely noticeable, was now an angry red, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Panic gripped him. It was as if the inn was toying with him, pulling at the threads of his past, forcing him to confront something he had long tried to forget. The air in the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the whispers began again. But this time they were louder, more insistent, circling around him like a predator stalking its prey. "You're not supposed to be here," the voices hissed, their tone dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have come back." The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer and more twisted. Carlos staggered backward, clutching the bear and the key, his pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot as the inn tightened its grip on him. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the grimy window, a figure stood behind him, cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but he could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. Carlos whipped around, but the room was empty. The whispers fell silent, but the sense of dread only deepened. Something had been unlocked, something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him all along. And now, with the key in his hand and his past unraveling before him, Carlos realized he was no longer just a visitor in the inn. He was part of its story, a story that had begun long before he arrived, and one that might not allow him to leave. Carlos's pulse quickened as he clutched the rusty key in his trembling hand. The bear from his childhood now lay discarded on the floor, but the weight of the past clung to him, suffocating. The whispers had returned, louder now, echoing through the hallways of the inn. They were no longer just faint murmurs. They were beckoning him, urging him to follow. His feet moved on their own, as though pulled by an invisible force, guiding him down the corridor toward an ornate door he hadn't noticed before. The wood was dark, almost black, carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift in the dim light. At the center of the door was a keyhole, exactly the size of the ancient key he now held. The cold metal burned against his palm as he hesitated, unsure of what lay beyond. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and the temperature seemed to drop with each passing second. The door called to him, whispering promises of answers, of escape. But at what cost? Carlos felt the familiar throb of the scar on his hand, now glowing faintly with an eerie light, as if it had come alive, feeding off the energy of the inn. He knew deep down that whatever was behind that door was tied to his past, to the night he had gotten lost, and to the faceless figure that haunted his dreams. The key turned in his hand, seemingly of its own accord, and the door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into blackness. His heart pounded as he stepped inside. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, each step echoing ominously as he descended. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a cavernous room, dimly lit by flickering lanterns that cast long, distorted shadows. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its surface rippling as though it were made of liquid. Carlos's reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. It wasn't just his own face he saw. Behind him, barely visible in the warped glass, was the shadowy figure he had glimpsed before. It loomed larger now, closer, its presence suffocating. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. In their place, a voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the room. "You must choose," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "Sacrifice what is most precious to you, or remain here forever." Carlos's mind reeled, trying to comprehend the meaning of the words. What could it mean? What was most precious to him? As if in answer, the mirror shimmered, revealing images, his memories. Moments from his past played out in the reflection. His childhood, his family, his happiest moments. They flickered before him like a cruel reminder of what he had to lose. But the mirror didn't stop there. It shifted again, this time showing something far darker. His family trapped in the inn, their faces pale, lifeless. They were being pulled into the shadows, their bodies contorted as they struggled against an unseen force. Carlos's stomach churned as he realized the truth. The inn had already ensnared them, feeding off their essence, just as it had done to countless others. The figure in the mirror, the entity, was offering him a twisted bargain. He could save them, but only if he was willing to sacrifice something in return. Carlos's hands shook as the full weight of the decision hit him. He could offer up his most cherished memory, the one thing that had kept him grounded all these years, or he could leave, abandoning his family to the darkness that consumed this place. The entity's voice returned, more insistent now. "Give me what I seek, or they will be lost to you forever." The mirror began to ripple again, showing his family's faces, their eyes wide with terror, silently pleading for his help. The scar on his hand pulsed painfully, the choice weighing heavier with each passing second. Tears welled in Carlos's eyes. Could he really give up his most precious memory? The memory of his mother's smile, of the warmth and love he had felt in her embrace, the memory that had kept him going after she passed? Without it, would he even be the same person? But the alternative was unthinkable, letting the inn claim his family as it had claimed so many others. The fear clawed at his chest, tightening its grip, suffocating him. His heart ached with impossibility of the decision. The shadows around him deepened, the figure in the mirror looming closer, its presence overwhelming. "Decide," the voice commanded, its tone dark and final. Carlos could feel time slipping away, the cold seeping into his bones as the weight of the choice crushed him. Every part of him screamed for an escape, for a way out of this nightmare, but there was none. The inn had trapped him, just as it had trapped the others before him. Now it demanded a price, one he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. With a shaking hand, Carlos reached toward the mirror, his reflection distorting in the rippling surface. He could feel the entity's gaze on him, waiting, hungry. The cold metal of the key pressed against his palm, and as the scar on his hand burned with a fiery intensity, he whispered, "I'm sorry." In that moment, the air around him thickened, the shadows twisting as the mirror consumed his reflection, and with it, the memory of his mother. The last connection to the life he once knew slipped away, leaving only an empty void where it had once resided. The inn fell silent. The entity had taken its price. But as Carlos stood there, alone in the darkness, he realized that the cost had been far greater than he had ever imagined. He had saved his family, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself that could never be regained. And now, with the inn's hunger momentarily sated, he was left to wonder, how long before it demanded more? The silence that followed Carlos's impossible choice was more terrifying than the whispers had ever been. The inn seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something or someone. The shadows along the walls no longer stood still. They slithered, twisted, and flickered in ways that defied explanation. The flickering light from the lanterns danced over the walls, but it wasn't the flames that moved. It was the darkness itself, shifting like it was alive, watching. Carlos felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him, though he was utterly alone in the vast, empty room. His heart pounded in his chest, the reality of what he had just done sinking deeper into his mind. The memory he had sacrificed, the essence of who he once was gone, and with it, a piece of his soul. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, hanging in the air like ghosts of his fear. The shadows that had once lurked in the corners now crept closer, oozing along the floor, merging into a dark, pulsing mass. At first, it was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but then Carlos saw it. Movement in the periphery of his vision. A figure darted just out of sight, barely a blur in the oppressive gloom. His muscles tensed as a primal instinct screamed that something was wrong, that he was no longer alone. Then, a faint sound broke the silence. A whisper. It was not a single voice, but many, layered on top of each other, faint and incomprehensible, like the muttering of the long-forgotten dead. The whispering grew louder, yet still elusive, its source impossible to pinpoint. The words were a maddening mix of pleas, threats, and promises, none of them fully formed, all of them chilling. Carlos turned in every direction, but the shadows now seemed to follow him, clinging to the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled faces, faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths silently screaming. His breathing quickened as he backed away, the weight of the inn's presence pressing in on him. The room itself seemed to warp, the once solid walls bending and shifting as if the inn was reshaping itself around him, like a living, breathing thing. Every step he took felt heavier, like walking through water, as if the air had thickened, turning into something almost physical, holding him in place. The whispers returned, louder this time, and now they were unmistakably calling his name. Carlos. The sound was like ice in his veins, the way his name dragged through the air, distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing, no one. The whispering persisted, more insistent now, the voice growing clearer, more distinct. You can't leave. You belong to us now. Carlos's heart raced as he realized the truth. The inn was alive. It had been watching him from the moment he arrived, pulling him deeper into its grasp, manipulating his mind, his memories. The whispers weren't just sounds, they were thoughts, the thoughts of those who had come before him, those who had been trapped here, just like him. The walls shuddered, as though the inn was breathing in sync with his terror, feeding off it. And then, something even more chilling occurred. The mirror in the center of the room, the one that had shown him the images of his past, began to warp again. Its surface rippled like disturbed water, and slowly, figures emerged. At first, they were just dark outlines, indistinguishable from shadows around him, but as they moved closer, they took on form, humanoid but wrong. Their bodies were elongated, their limbs unnaturally thin, and their faces were devoid of features, smooth as porcelain, yet somehow full of menace. They moved silently, gliding through the room like wraiths, their heads turning unnaturally in his direction. Carlos stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel their eyes on him, though they had none. The whispering grew louder, deafening, as the figures closed in. You called us, they murmured in unison, their voices hollow and ancient. And now, we come for what's ours. Carlos's skin prickled with terror. He hadn't called anyone, had he? He racked his brain, trying to remember if there had been something he had done, something that had invited this nightmare into existence. But the more he thought, the more the memory of the sacrifice, the key, the mirror, the loss, blurred in his mind, becoming distant, unreachable. The scar on his hand burned, searing with pain, as though the entity itself was inside him now, marking him. The shadows on the walls began to melt, pooling on the floor, rising up like smoke until they formed a circle around him. The figures from the mirror drew closer, their presence pressing against his senses, suffocating him. Their whispers filled his ears, and now they were speaking directly to him, their voices laced with hunger. You've lost what you were. Now you belong here, with us. Panic surged in Carlos's chest as the reality of the situation hit him. This was not a battle he could win. The inn had trapped him, body and soul, and now it wanted everything. He looked desperately toward the door, but it was gone. The room had transformed, walls shifting, warping, closing in like a maze with no exit. His vision blurred, his body feeling heavy, as if the shadows themselves were wrapping around him, pulling him down into the dark. The whispering became a roar in his ears, and for a moment, he thought he heard a familiar voice, a woman's voice, faint but clear. "Run." It was barely a whisper, but it broke through the cacophony of voices like a lifeline. Carlos snapped back to attention, his feet moving before he could even think. He ran, dodging the shifting walls, the crawling shadows, the faceless figures. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted through the darkness, his breath ragged, his legs burning. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispering followed, and the shadows clung to him like a second skin. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive, a creature of darkness that wanted him, needed him. And as Carlos ran, he realized with horrifying clarity, there was no escaping it. The inn had become part of him, and even if he somehow found a way out, it would follow. It would always follow. Carlos's frantic escape through the inn's shifting corridors was driven by pure survival instinct, but as he ran, the lines between reality and illusion blurred. The walls around him twisted and stretched, as if the inn itself were alive, reshaping to trap him. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the oppressive silence, and every corner he turned led him deeper into a maze that seemed to have no end. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath him buckled, and he stumbled into a dark, cavernous room. It was unfamiliar, nothing like the rest of the inn, yet it felt as if it had been waiting for him all along. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and the shadows here were darker, more alive, writhing against the walls like they were feeding off his fear. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate chair, almost like a throne, surrounded by candles that flickered with a ghostly, unnatural light. Carlos's skin prickled as a cold sweat broke out across his body. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but his legs refused to move. Something was compelling him to stay. The whispers, ever present in the background, began to change, now clearer, more personal. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were promises. The voice, low and seductive, filled the room. "Sit, Carlos. Rest. It can all end here. The fear, the confusion. Let us help you." The words were a dark lullaby, soothing and terrifying at the same time. Carlos shook his head, trying to resist, but the room seemed to close in on him, his breath quickening as the weight of the unseen presence pressed down on his chest. His body felt heavy, as if every step he took was dragging him deeper into the earth. Visions began to dance before his eyes, distorted, nightmarish images of the life he thought he knew. He saw his family, but their faces were twisted, their expressions vacant, their eyes hollow and black. They stood at the edge of his vision, watching him, accusing him. "You could have saved us, but you chose fear," they whispered in unison, their voices blending with insidious tones that filled the room. His mother's face appeared, and the memory he had sacrificed twisted into something grotesque. Her eyes locked onto his, but instead of love, they were filled with contempt. The room shifted again, the shadows pulling at him, drawing out his deepest fears. The chair in the center of the room now seemed like a refuge, a place of safety amid the chaos. "Just sit, Carlos," the voice urged, more insistent now. "Let go of the pain. Let go of the fear. You've already lost everything." Carlos's head swam as the darkness played tricks on his mind. The words echoed in his ears, growing louder with each passing second. His vision blurred, the walls breathing around him, until it felt like he was underwater, drowning in his own terror. And then, out of the darkness, came the visions, more real, more vivid than anything he had seen before. He saw himself, sitting in the chair, calm, free of fear, with the horrors of the inn fading into the background. The pain that throbbed in his scarred hand vanished, replaced by a numbness, a peaceful emptiness. But behind this calm, he could feel the entity, the thing that controlled the inn, pressing into his mind. It promised him freedom, but not the kind he wanted. It was offering him release from his fear. Yes, but at the cost of everything. His memories, his soul. Carlos staggered back, his mind racing. The room pulsed with dark energy, and he realized with horror that the inn wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was tempting him to embrace it, to give in to the terror and let it consume him completely. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, the slow creeping dread that he had been running from ever since he entered this cursed place. The fear wasn't just a reaction. It was a lure, a trap, designed to make him surrender to the darkness within himself. His breathing became ragged, and he could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. The voice whispered again, softer now, almost gentle. "You've always been afraid, Carlos. You've always known this moment would come. There's no escape from what you are." The shadows seemed to close in tighter, wrapping around him like a shroud. He wanted to run, to fight, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the fear that gnawed at his soul. His mind fractured, unable to hold onto the reality he thought he knew. Memories flickered in and out of his consciousness, his childhood, his family, the lost memory of his mother's embrace. But they all felt distant, like they were slipping through his fingers, dissolving into the darkness. The more he tried to hold on, the more the fear twisted them into something grotesque. Faces morphed into demons, voices became screams, and the warmth of his happiest moments turned to ash. In the depths of his mind, Carlos could hear another voice, faint but familiar. His own voice. "Don't give in. Don't let it take you." But the temptation was strong, stronger than anything he had ever felt. He could end it all right now, sit in the chair, and let the fear take over. The darkness offered him peace, a numbness that would erase the pain, the confusion, the terror. But in doing so, he would lose himself completely. His scar throbbed violently, as if trying to warn him, to pull him back to reality. Carlos gritted his teeth, fighting against the pull of the inn, but the seductive lure of fear gnawed at him. He could feel it wrapping around his mind, tugging him toward the chair. Every step he took backward felt like wading through thick, invisible chains, dragging him closer to the decision he didn't want to make. With one final, desperate effort, Carlos screamed into the void, his voice shaking with terror. "I won't give in." The words echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in his mind. The shadows recoiled for a moment, as if shocked by his defiance, but they did not retreat. The room trembled, and the chair remained, beckoning him still. But Carlos knew the truth now. The inn, the darkness, the fear, it wasn't something he could defeat. It was part of him. It had always been part of him, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the moment when he would finally surrender. And though he had resisted for now, he knew deep down that the fight wasn't over. It would never be over. The inn would wait, as it always had, for him to make the choice. And the next time, he wasn't sure he would be strong enough to resist. Carlos stood in the dim, suffocating room, his breath shallow and ragged as the walls pulsed with a malevolent life of their own. Then seemed to have a heartbeat now, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hollow chamber around him. His mind raced, each thought colliding with the next in a desperate attempt to understand. He had resisted the chair, resisted giving in to the fear that wanted to consume him, but he knew this was not the end. The inn had not yet revealed its true face, and the worst was still to come. He could feel it lurking just beneath the surface, a darkness waiting for him to make the next move. The shadows around him twisted unnaturally, elongating into grotesque shapes that defied the laws of reality. Faces appeared in the darkness, their hollow eyes watching him, judging him, as though he were a prisoner awaiting his sentence. And then, out of the swirling shadows, the air grew heavy with a presence. Carlos could feel it before he could see it. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, for this very moment. It wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was pulling him toward a final confrontation with the entity that had been manipulating him from the start. A low rumble reverberated through the room, and the mirror that had shown him the visions of his past began to ripple once more. But this time, the reflection was different. The glass warped and twisted, distorting Carlos's image until it shattered into 1,000 pieces, each fragment reflecting a different version of himself. His face contorted in agony, in terror, in madness. And standing among those reflections, rising from the shards of the broken mirror, was the figure he had seen in the corners of his vision since entering the inn. A tall, shadowy silhouette, its form fluid and shifting, like smoke trapped in human shape. The entity stepped forward, though it made no sound, no movement of its own. Its presence simply filled the room, consuming everything else. The temperature dropped instantly, freezing the air around Carlos, his breath crystallizing in front of him. His scar burned again, an excruciating pulse of pain that shot through his body like fire. He clutched his hand, eyes wide as the figure's face, or what passed for a face, came into view. It had no features, only a smooth, dark void where eyes, a mouth, and a nose should have been. Yet Carlos could feel its gaze piercing into him, cold and unrelenting. The voice came not from a figure itself, but from the very walls of the inn, surrounding him, filling his mind. "You have come far, Carlos," it whispered, its tone a mixture of mockery and hunger. "But now you stand at the precipice of truth. There is no more running, no more hiding. You have always been destined to face me." Carlos's heart raced, his body frozen in place as he stared into the darkness of the figure's form. He could feel its power, ancient and unfathomable, radiating from it in waves. The weight of the inn's history, the countless souls it had consumed, all seemed to bear down on him in that moment. "Why you?" Carlos managed to choke out, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. The entity did not move, but the shadows around it writhed in response, as though delighted by his question. "I am the fear you buried," the voice replied, its tone almost gleeful. "I am the truth you refused to see. I am the darkness that has been with you since the moment you entered this place. And now, I am the one who will decide your fate." Carlos's scar throbbed violently, and he gasped in pain, his knees buckling beneath him. The truth hit him like a tidal wave. This entity wasn't just an external force. It had been inside him all along, feeding on his fear, his regrets, his lost memories. The inn wasn't just a place. It was a reflection of his own mind, his own soul, twisted and corrupted by the darkness he had carried with him for years. The entity's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You came here seeking answers, but what you found was yourself, fractured and broken. Now, you must choose. Embrace the darkness and become part of me, or fight and be consumed by it." The room around them shifted, the walls trembling as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. Carlos's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one pulling him in a different direction. Could he fight this thing? Could he resist the darkness, knowing it had been with him all along? Or was he already lost, doomed from the moment he set foot in the inn? The entity stepped closer, its presence oppressive, suffocating. He could feel the cold tendrils of its essence wrapping around his limbs, pulling him down into the depths of his own fear. Visions assaulted him again, his mother's face, twisted with the same malice that now filled the inn, his childhood, tainted by the very darkness that stood before him. The memories he had sacrificed had not been taken. They had been twisted, turned into weapons by the entity, used against him. And now, it demanded the final piece, his soul. The shadows surged forward, and Carlos screamed as they enveloped him, pulling him into the void. But in that moment, something broke through the darkness. A faint glimmer of light, a memory untouched by the entity's corruption. It was the memory of his mother's voice, calm, soothing, calling to him. "Don't let it take you, Carlos," she whispered. "You are stronger than the fear." The light flickered, dim but steady, cutting through the shadows that threatened to consume him. Carlos gritted his teeth, fighting against the darkness that coiled around him. "I won't let you win," he growled, his voice trembling but defiant. The entity recoiled slightly, surprised by his resistance. But the darkness surged again, more powerful than before. The ground beneath him trembled, and the inn itself seemed to groan in protest as the battle between light and shadow raged within Carlos's soul. His scar blazed with pain, but he used it, channeled it, turning the pain into strength. The entity's voice filled the room, furious now. "You cannot escape me, Carlos. I am everything you fear, everything you've ever run from. You cannot defeat yourself." But Carlos no longer believed the entity's lies. The fear was real, yes, but it wasn't insurmountable. It wasn't all he was. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he reached for the light, pulling it toward him, letting it fill the cracks that the darkness had created. His mind cleared, his fear gave way to resolve, and with one final, desperate push, he stood tall. The entity let out a deafening scream, a sound of pure rage and frustration, as the light shattered the shadows around him. The inn quaked, its walls splintering as the darkness was torn apart. Carlos felt the weight lift from his chest, the oppressive presence receding. The figure in front of him flickered, then dissolved into nothingness, leaving only silence. Breathing heavily, Carlos looked around. The inn was still, the shadows gone, but he knew this was not the end. The fear would always be with him, lurking in the corners of his mind. Yet now, he knew the truth. He could face it. He could survive it. And as the light of dawn began to break through the shattered windows, Carlos turned and walked out of the inn, leaving the darkness behind for now. Carlos stepped into the dim hallway, the air still thick with the oppressive presence of the inn. His heart was pounding in his chest, but now there was a strange calm within him, an understanding that the darkness, the fear, was still there waiting. The entity had not been truly defeated, only pushed back. The inn was still alive, its walls still pulsing faintly, as though breathing in the aftermath of their confrontation. But Carlos knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The entity wasn't done with him yet. It was preparing for the final act, the last test. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long, lined with old, broken mirrors that reflected not his own image, but distorted versions of him, twisted and gaunt, their faces hollow, eyes sunken deep into the skull. Each reflection whispered as he passed, their voices low and mocking, reminding him of his every failure, every fear he had tried to bury. But Carlos did not stop. He couldn't. Something was pulling him forward, deeper into the heart of the inn, toward the place where the entity waited for the final confrontation. The corridor ended abruptly in front of a heavy, wooden door, its surface marked with deep, jagged scratches as though something had been trying to claw its way out, or in. A faint light flickered from underneath the door, casting long shadows on the floor. Carlos hesitated, his hand hovering just above the cold iron handle. He knew that whatever was behind that door held the answers he sought, but it also held the full, unrestrained power of the entity, waiting to consume him once and for all. With a deep breath, Carlos pushed the door open, and the world beyond it shifted into something far more nightmarish than he had anticipated. The room was vast and empty, the walls made of black stone that seemed to absorb the light. In the center of the room stood the entity, no longer a mere shadow in the corner of his vision, but a towering figure of darkness, its form fluid and ever-changing. It had grown, feeding off the fear and despair that had built up within the inn for centuries. The air crackled with malevolent energy, a cold so intense that it made Carlos's breath come out in frozen puffs. The entity's face was featureless, yet Carlos could feel its gaze boring into him, as if it was reading every thought, every weakness. "You think you've won something," the entity hissed, its voice a low growl that seemed to echo from the very foundation of the inn. "But you have only delayed the inevitable." Carlos clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the scar on his hand burning again, a reminder of the battle he had already fought. He knew he couldn't run, couldn't hide from what was about to happen. The entity had lured him here for a reason, and now it was time to confront the truth about the inn, about his past, and about the fear that had haunted him since childhood. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble as the entity moved toward him, slow and deliberate, its form towering above him, blotting out the faint light in the room. The shadows it cast warped and twisted, coiling around Carlos like serpents, pulling him down. His legs felt heavy, as though the air itself was weighing him down, pressing him toward the cold stone floor. "You are nothing without your fear," the entity whispered, its voice soft now, but filled with a venomous edge. "You belong to me. You always have." Carlos staggered backward, his mind racing as the tendrils of darkness crept closer, wrapping around his ankles, climbing higher with each passing second. His body screamed at him to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The inn had sealed itself around them, trapping him in this place where light could not survive. The entity's words were like poison in his veins, each one sinking deeper, making him doubt everything he had fought for. But then, amid the suffocating darkness, a thought pierced through the fog of fear. The entity had been feeding on his terror, his regret, twisting his memories to keep him weak. But fear was not the only force within him. Somewhere deep down, buried beneath the trauma and pain, was the truth he had clung to all along, the strength he had inherited from his mother, the love that had protected him in his darkest moments. It had always been there, even when he couldn't see it. Summoning every ounce of courage left within him, Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out the object that had been with him all this time, the small, battered bear from his childhood. It was a symbol of the past, of a time when fear had first taken root in him. But it was also a reminder of innocence, of resilience. The bear was more than just a token from his past. It was the embodiment of everything the entity could not take from him. The shadows recoiled as Carlos held the bear up, and for the first time, the entity hesitated. Its form rippled, as though the darkness itself was faltering. "You cannot defeat me," it snarled, but there was a crack in its voice, an edge of uncertainty. The inn trembled, the walls shuddering as though they, too, were afraid. Carlos took a step forward, his voice steady despite the fear still gnawing at him. "You have no power over me," he said, his words firm. "You've tried to control me through fear, but fear is not all I am. I remember now. I remember what you took from me, and I won't let you take anything more." The entity let out a guttural roar, the room shaking violently as its form expanded, tendrils of shadow lashing out at Carlos. But this time, he did not flinch. The light within him, the memory of his mother's love, of the strength he had buried deep, shone through, cutting through the darkness. The shadows that had once felt impenetrable now seemed weak, fragile, as if the entity's power was unraveling before his eyes. The inn groaned, the walls cracking as light began to seep in through the fractures. The entity screamed, its form writhing and twisting in agony as the light grew stronger, tearing through the shadows, banishing them one by one. Carlos stood his ground, refusing to be pulled into the darkness again. He held the bear tightly, his grip unwavering as the inn's foundations crumbled around him. With one final, ear-splitting shriek, the entity disintegrated, its form collapsing into a cloud of black smoke that dissipated into the air. The room grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the light flooded in, filling every corner of the once dark space. The inn itself seemed to sigh, as though it had been freed from the curse that had bound it for so long. Carlos fell to his knees, exhausted but alive. The battle was over. The entity was gone. But as the light of dawn broke through the shattered windows, he knew that the inn had left its mark on him, just as it had on all those who had come before him. The fear would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but now he understood something more powerful. He could survive it. He could face it. He stood slowly, looking around the empty room one last time before walking toward the door. The whispers had fallen silent. The shadows were gone. But as Carlos stepped outside, into the fresh morning air, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something unfinished. The inn was quiet now, but deep down, He knew that its dark heart still beat, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The sun was rising as Carlos stumbled out of the inn, its first rays breaking through the thinning fog, casting long shadows across the valley. He breathed deeply, feeling the cold morning air fill his lungs, but the tension in his chest hadn't fully lifted. Behind him, the inn loomed silently, its dark windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. It seemed smaller now, less menacing, as if the defeat of the entity had stripped it of its power. But as Carlos gazed back at the old building, something deep within him whispered that the terror wasn't truly over. There was something left unresolved, a question that gnawed at the edges of his mind. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, and his thoughts were clouded with the memories of what had just occurred. The entity, the inn, the darkness that had nearly consumed him. It all felt like a nightmare, something impossible to fully grasp. He had faced it, fought it, and survived, but he knew the inn had changed him. As much as he wanted to believe that the evil had been vanquished, there was a lingering presence, a shadow that clung to the edges of his consciousness. It was as if the inn had left a mark on him, one that wouldn't easily fade. Carlos turned his back on the building, walking toward his car parked further down the gravel road. The valley was eerily quiet now, the fog dissipating slowly as the sun continued to rise, revealing the landscape in soft hues of orange and gold. But the peace felt fragile, like the calm after a storm that might return at any moment. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound too loud in the stillness. Every step felt like he was walking away from something unfinished, a truth he had yet to uncover. As he approached the car, his hand brushed against his pocket, and he froze. The small bear, the one that had been with him throughout this entire ordeal, was gone. Panic shot through him as he patted his pockets, searching frantically, but the bear had simply vanished. His heart pounded in his chest, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Had he left it behind, or had Inn taken it? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. That bear had been more than just a childhood memento. It had been his anchor to the past, a link to everything he had tried to hold on to. And now, it was gone, just like everything else the inn had claimed. Carlos glanced back at the inn. It stood there, silent and unmoving, but something about its presence felt wrong. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch him, as if the inn itself was waiting. Waiting for what, though? He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. The thought made his skin crawl. Even with the entity gone, the inn still felt alive, still lurking in the shadows of his mind. He climbed into the car, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The ignition sputtered to life, and the sound of the engine brought a momentary relief. But as he drove down the winding road that led away from the valley, the sensation of being watched never left him. The road stretched out before him, disappearing into the morning mist, but in the rear-view mirror, the inn remained visible, even as the distance grew. No matter how far he drove, it stayed there, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the inn vanished into the fog, swallowed by the landscape. For a moment, Carlos felt a surge of hope, believing he had finally escaped its grip. But the road ahead began to shift. The trees lining the path grew taller, more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog thickened once more, rolling in from the edges of the road, creeping closer. His heart raced as a familiar dread settled in his gut. The further he drove, the more the scenery seemed to warp, as if the valley itself refused to let him leave. The whispers returned, faint at first, like echoes carried on the wind. But soon, they grew louder, more distinct, just as they had been inside the inn. His name, repeated over and over, filled the car, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Carlos. Carlos. The voice was the same, soft, malevolent, and inescapable. His grip tightened on the wheel as he pressed the accelerator, trying to outrun the whispers, but the road twisted unnaturally, curving back toward the valley as if pulling him into a loop he couldn't escape. His pulse quickened as the fog enveloped the car, blurring his surroundings until the road itself was barely visible. Panic clawed at him, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this real? Had he ever left the inn? Or was this part of its twisted game, trapping him in an endless cycle of fear and despair? He slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the gravel road. And for a moment, the world stood still. The fog swirled around him, dense and impenetrable, and in the silence that followed, he could hear only his own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the fog parted, revealing something that made his blood run cold. The inn, impossibly, stood directly in front of him once more, its dark, oppressive form towering above him. It was as if he had never left. The road had brought him back, no matter how far he had tried to escape. The whispers were louder now, closer, echoing from the walls of the inn, and with a sinking realization, Carlos understood the truth. The inn hadn't let him go. It had never intended to. The entity had been only part of the horror that haunted this place. The inn itself was alive, a creature of darkness, and had marked him from the moment he stepped inside. The battle he thought he had won was nothing more than a cruel illusion. The inn wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and now it had its hold on him, tighter than ever before. No matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, the inn would always be with him, pulling him back. Carlos stared at the building, its windows dark and soulless, and realized with chilling clarity that he was part of it now. The inn had taken something from him, his memories, his fears, his very soul, and in exchange, it had given him this, an endless loop of terror, a prison he could never escape. He could feel it inside him, the cold tendrils of the inn's influence creeping into his mind, warping his thoughts. With a shaking hand, Carlos turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, the fog thick and suffocating. He walked toward the inn, the pull of its darkness irresistible, and as the door creaked open once more, he knew there would be no escape. The inn had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. And now, it would wait for the next soul, the next unwitting traveler to wander too close. The door shut behind him with a final, ominous thud, and the valley fell silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened. But the mystery remained. The inn was still there, hidden in the fog, waiting. And it always would be.